This is David Harvey, and you're listening to the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a podcast that looks at capitalism through a Marxist lens. This podcast is made possible by Democracy at Work.
You know, there's a story which I've encountered in many, many different places over the last 10 years or so, which says that when we look at the demographics of the United States, the future looks very grim for republicanism. It looks very rosy for Democrats. The argument is that the country is becoming more diverse. We'll very soon be a country where the minorities make up the majority. And to the degree that the Republican Party relies upon basically a very white vote, this means that the natural majority here, electoral majority here in the United States, is that of the Democrats, because they've always catered to those populations. But there's something wrong with this story, and I think we're in the process of seeing what is wrong with this story and let it unfold. And I think the simplest way to think about what is wrong with the story is not to look at the United States, but to look at the situation in Brazil. Brazil is a rather conservative country in lots of ways, and it's a very religious country. Historically, the religion has been Catholicism, but it's now become very much caught up with the evangelicals. About 20 years ago, the evangelical population in Brazil was around, 7 or 8, or maybe 10%. It's now around 40%. Now, the evangelical movement in Brazil has been fostered and financed and helped on its way by evangelical interests in the United States. Now, there's an election coming up in Brazil. By the time this session will have reached the public, the election will be over, or at least the first part of the election will be over. And all the signs are that in spite of incredible unpopularity and incompetence and all the rest of it, that Bolsonaro may well come out of the election okay, which would be a bit of a surprise. And the liberal media in this country finds very hard to understand how and why that could be. But the answer is, quite simply, it's the evangelicals. The evangelicals will vote as a solid bloc for Bolsonaro, and they will vote against Lula and the return of the Workers' Party to political power. Now, this situation I encountered firsthand when I was invited to Rio de Janeiro a couple of years ago. Well, no, maybe 3 years ago now, to participate in, if you like, a political program which was focused on the Socialist Party and the Socialist Party candidate for mayor who was running to be mayor of Rio de Janeiro. And the idea was to hold seminars and symposiums and so on in order to try to bolster the left cause in general. And so I was participating in that. But all along, I was basically told there's very little chance that we're actually going to win this election because the leading candidate on the other side is evangelical, and the evangelicals have the majority of the vote in the city. Now, where does this evangelical thing come from, and what is it about? And I think we are about to see also the evangelical vote in the United States starting to actually start to dominate in some elections. And the forthcoming elections, I think it will be very strongly present, and it may well even win, and against what should be some very strong odds against, it may win, because as far as the evangelicals are concerned, Trump is great and Trump deserves to win. So the evangelical movement then is beginning to have a very significant global presence. And this raises then something very important to me about, well, what is the role of religious movements in politics, and what's their relationship to capital accumulation, and to what degree do we have to convert our attention, change our gaze, if you like, in terms of who is the opposition, from a situation in which we are clearly against the sort of white nationalist groups, or against the big business and big business interests and so on, to recognize that what the real opponent has to be is going to be the evangelical movement and the evangelical influence on politics. Now, this question of religion and politics, I'm very hesitant to talk about it, but I have to talk about it. And I'm going to talk about it entirely from the standpoint of my own experience within it. I'm not an expert. I haven't done a great deal of historical reading, and I've not done a great deal of thinking. I would never claim to be an expert, but I've had some experience, and so out of that experience, I will relate some important facts. When I came to this country in 1969, I came as a person who had no real interest in religion. I would not say I was an atheist, because an atheist is too activist. I'd say I was agnostic. I just wasn't terribly interested in what was being said. And therefore, when I was coming to this country, and I became politically engaged, and I came at the end of the anti-war movement, but even more important, in the closing years of what might call the high point of the civil rights movement. Now, the first thing I had to do when I came to this country was to recognize that politics was very much more inflected with religion here than it was in Britain. The civil rights movement, which of course was startling in its intensity and also in its achievements in the 1960s, was essentially anchored by the black churches. And the church was very significant as a political force. And I had to recognize this in Baltimore when I started to become active in politics in the city in 1970 or so, that there were two sources of power in the city that were significant. One was the trade union movement and the AFL-CIO and the various unions, hospital workers union, the garbage workers union, and all the rest of it. These unions were very, very significant and powerful, and had a very strong effect. And the other, of course, was the civil rights movement and the black churches, where it's effectively the strong organizational power. Well, over the period of time in the 1980s, the labor movement was disempowered. It was disempowered by deindustrialization, disempowered through offshoring, disempowered through technological change. And so in the end, by the time we get to the 1990s, there is only one organizational form which is at the center of maintenance of political power, which is the churches. And by the time you get to the 1990s, in Baltimore at least, it wasn't simply the Black Ministerial Alliance, which had been so significant in the 1960s, but the inner city religious alliance, which included Protestant churches and included Jewish communities and the like. So if you wanted to get anything done in Baltimore in the 1980s, you effectively had to negotiate through the churches, and the politics of the churches were very, very clear. And they were what you might call civil rights, obviously, but fairly progressive, though not necessarily progressive on social issues. The inner city church movement, for example, was not supportive of gay rights, and the city council was not supportive of LGBTQ causes. And only very late in the day did they start to recognize that they needed to take a progressive position on these matters. But the religious side of this starts to become even more significant when we see exactly how politics and religion were matched together. Now, the other place in which I learned a great deal about the religious side of things was when I was in Central America, and I spent a little time there in the 1970s, at the time when the revolutionary movements in Latin America and Central America were very, very strong. The FMLN in El Salvador, the Sandinistas, of course, in Nicaragua. And what then I learned was this tremendous power of the Catholic Church in particular in relationship to these political movements. And that political power attached to a certain angle of the Catholic Church, and particularly depended upon an option for the poor, in which people were organizing and priests were organizing in low-income communities and low and deprived communities were mobilizing in very clear ways to try to improve the social situation of their congregations. Now, this was, to me, was a very remarkable thing, that when we went to Nicaragua, for example, and I spent a little time in Nicaragua and also in Costa Rica, where the Nicaraguan revolution was taking place and the Sandinista revolution was taking place. And in that process, I had the chance to meet and talk with some of the various people in the Catholic Church, particularly a priest called Ernesto Cardenal. Now, Ernesto Cardenal was a sort of a poet, theologian, priest. He'd set up a sort of communal organization on an island in Lake Managua where people went to study, working with peasants and so on. So it was a very, very kind of Christian-based community philosophy. And there was a lot of that going on in Central America at that time, and most of it was religiously inspired. And the religion was, of course, the theology of liberation. Now, the theology of liberation was very, very strong in Latin America during these years. And it was very strong, actually, in general. And of course, the theology of liberation with activism of an option for the poor led to the formation of organized resistance to the systems of oppression on the land and systems of oppression in the cities, which were remarkably present throughout the whole region. To me, this was a very significant thing. I mean, I would go to meetings in Baltimore, which were sort of inspired by, say, Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow Coalition movement. We would always begin our movement with a prayer, and I had to get used to the fact that though I was not religious, I was expected to hold hands with everybody else and engage in this prayer. In Latin America, again, a lot of the movement was sort of inspired by religious by religiosity and by religious organization, and the churches were a very significant part of this, and the churches were very, very connected to political action. In Costa Rica, for example, I went to a commune where the priest and the local population had organized a rest center for the guerrilla fighters coming out of Nicaragua, they would sometimes come out wounded and need care, and they needed rest and that before going back in to fight the fight in Nicaragua. And in talking to the priest, we asked the kind of question of, well, this is a very organized thing here, and you're obviously political active. The population is with you. The population were providing all of the services that needed to be provided, providing the food and healthcare and help and all that kind of thing. And this is a very, very progressive thing. It was a Christian-based community, as it were, and the priest was at the head of it. And I kind of said, well, how do you get on with the hierarchy, the bishop and so on? And in this case, the bishop was not terribly fond of what they were doing. But he said something very interesting to me, which I think was very prophetic. And that very interesting thing was this. He said, look, I don't need the bishops to do what I'm doing. I've got the support of the people. The people want to do this. I am very much with them. I try to give them guidance, and we help, and we work very well. I am more important to the bishops than the bishops are important to me. Because without me, the bishops would not have the kind of popular base which they get from actually the kind of work that I'm doing here. So when the bishops come down here and tell me to stop doing what I'm doing, I'm saying, well, if I stop doing what I'm doing, you'll no longer have a base, a populist base for you. And he said, I've had that conversation a couple of times. And they then left me alone and said, oh, well, basically you continue doing what you're doing. Well, the theology of liberation was so strong in Central America that it sparked all kinds of attacks upon religious figures. Archbishop Romero in El Salvador got assassinated in his church. There were sort of 4 American nuns who were murdered in El Salvador. And the other thing that I learned while there was, and I had an opportunity to talk to one of the members of the junta that came into power in Nicaragua after the revolution had succeeded, Sergio Ramirez, a poet, a literary figure and the like, who was one of the junta. And he said a couple of interesting and, again, memorable things to me, which were this. And he said, it's interesting. Many people here like to talk about globalization. And they're thinking about, oh, my goodness, how do we organize against globalization? Well, he said, if you want a ready-made organization, which is global in structure and which is capable of confronting globalization, you would go to the Jesuits. And he said nearly all of the people that working in a lot of this revolutionary movement in Nicaragua come from a Jesuit background. All of us got our ideas about justice and so on in the Jesuit seminaries. And that educational base gave an ideological base and a Christian base, if you like, to what it was we were doing. Now, so that was, if you like, the situation in the 1970s. Now, this became very much more of a problem for the Catholic Church itself. When Romero was assassinated, you would have expected the Pope to have condemned immediately, but the Pope basically said nothing. And the big question was, well, why not? And it was partly because the Pope was actually aging and not in very good shape, and the theologian who was basically running, if you like, the ideas section of the Vatican was Ratzinger. Now, Ratzinger was a very, very conservative. He later became Pope Benedict and was terribly reactionary and right wing. And Benedict was very, very angry about all of this politicization going on throughout the Americas. And the result of that was that he started to actually tell the Jesuits, he called the Jesuits to Rome and basically forced them to recant and get out of doing all of the sort of work they were doing. So the Jesuit base was eroded. He also, at the same time, took all of those people who are articulate in terms of voicing the option of the poor and the option for the poor and the philosophy of theology of liberation, he took all of those and started to silence them. Cardinal Wolff, Brazil, was a very, very prominent person. He was basically sworn to silence for something like 20 years. Now, what this meant was that the theology of liberation, which had been very, very significant in Latin American politics all along, was basically curtailed by Ratzinger. There was a Jesuit who was a Democratic representative in Congress, Cardinal his name was Father Drinan, and he was forced to leave, and everybody was forced to leave. And what happened was that Ernesto Cardenal, who became culture minister in the Sandinista government, was ordered to abandon his position. He refused, and therefore he was subject to disciplinary action. What really happened was Ratzinger, right-wing Catholic, put an end to the field of the philosophy of the theology of liberation. Now, look what this meant. It's interesting. When you look at the Zapatista uprising in Mexico, there are lots of stories about, well, it was indigenous communities using their indigenous cultural forms and configurations, connecting with the sort of comandante who came from a sort of educated political background. But later on, research suggests that the foundations for what the Zapatistas were doing were largely laid by priests who were caught up in the option for the poor and caught up with theology of liberation. And therefore, the Zapatista movement and the Sandinista movement were all of them, to some degree, caught up in the theology of liberation. In Brazil, the landless peasant movement, the MST, which is one of the most powerful organizations to this day in political organizations in Brazil, was founded by Catholics and by Catholic priests, and it has its origins in again this whole kind of arena. But then what happened, as I've suggested, was the Vatican, thanks to Ratzinger, decided to discipline all this and to stop it. And as they stopped it, so created a vacuum as to who was going to speak for the people on the ground. In come the evangelicals. So in some ways, the evangelical hegemony, which is now threatening the dominance of the Catholic Church in Latin America, that hegemony is being challenged by the rising hegemony of the evangelical movements. Now, so we've got a situation in Latin America where suddenly the church wakes up after the disastrous reign of Benedict as Ratzinger as Pope, where they appoint a Pope from Latin America. Now, take the significance of this: a Pope from Latin America. And for a very simple reason, because in Latin America, it was going evangelical, big time, big way, and they were desperate to try to maintain their base. And it's like that priest who said to me, the bishops need me more than I need the bishops. They didn't understand that. And basically, the bishops disciplined all of their base, and the base went away, and they lost their power at the base, and they now have to face the fact that the evangelicals are as important, if not more important, in some parts of Latin America than that segment of the Catholic Church, which is inspired by was inspired by the theology of liberation, which is now effectively dead and gone. This situation then says, look, the demographics, and we can do this worldwide, but we also could do it very much inside the United States. Yes, the demographics suggest that the Democrats ought to be hegemonic, but they're not hegemonic because evangelical thinking is becoming hegemonic in the United States. Now, actually, the biggest religious movement in the United States, it turns out, is not the evangelicals, but is the agnostics like me, and the agnostics and the atheists. But we're disorganized. We have no church that we're going to. We're not caught up in things. When I was in the anti-war movement in Baltimore in the early 1970s, the center of it were the Quakers. So religion becomes very important, and it's very important in terms of how the religion is organized and what the organizing principle is. Now, we have seen social movement after social movement emerge around the world, but there's no organizing force at the center of it. The trade unions are not able to do it in most parts of the world. They still exist quite powerfully in some. But in most parts of the world, the trade union movement is not, and socialist movement is not very, very strong. And in much of the world, also, the evangelical movement is taking over. But there is a need, and this is, I think, the important argument I want to make. There's a need to have within a political movement some notion of meaning, some notion of the meaning of existence, of life, and all the rest of it, that makes for the importance of some sort of religious doctrine central to what politics can be about. And I find it fascinating that when I found it very surprised when I was in China to be in Nanjing and be told, they've rebuilt the Buddhist chapel. And suddenly you realize that actually there is a revival of religion going on in China, which is not Muslim, not Christian, not Falun Gong and all the rest of it. It's actually Buddhism, because Buddhism is, if you like, the religion which is least actively political and is most easily absorbed within the orbit of the Communist Party and what the Communist Party is about. So the Communist Party is actually helping reestablish Buddhism and Confucianism as part and parcel of its kind of the background. It doesn't come out and say, oh, we are all part of that, but it tolerates that in ways it does not tolerate active Christian, active Muslim, religious movements. So the role of religion then has been, in my experience, very, very significant politically, and we have to take it seriously. Even though I'm not particularly religious, I respect very much what the religious people have done and what they can do, particularly the Theology of Liberation. And I think that it's not accidental that the leadership of the poor people's movement in this country and the United States is based in Reverend William Barber, and so the religious basis is very, very strong. So that I am very, very convinced that while demographics in this country are moving in ways that will support the democratic program, what we're seeing instead is that the evangelical movement is becoming, if you like, something else about what that demographic is believing in. And the believing in the evangelical movement is becoming, if you like, a very, very significant force in this country this time. And it has to be combated directly if we're going to actually, instead of us assuming that somehow or other the demographic movement's going to come in the Democrats' favor and ultimately towards socialism. No, we've got to deal with the evangelical movement and its embrace of white nationalism and white supremacy and all of those kinds of things. So the evangelical movement is now becoming a significant part of the problem. And if this current election goes to Republicans, which I fear that is going to happen, it's going to be largely because of the evangelical influence. And if Lula does not get elected in Brazil and Bolsonaro gets re-elected in Brazil, it's going to be because of the evangelical influence. And therefore, that then says this is a political task which has to be acknowledged, understood, and then worked for and worked against. And here, I think it's very important to say this is not being anti-religion. religion has an extremely important role. In the same way that there are two wings of the Catholic Church, at least, one of which was taken up with the Theology of Liberation. The other, Opus Dei, was extremely conservative and reactionary and pro-capitalist and pro-hierarchy. In that exactly the same way, so evangelical non-conformist movements can be divided between, say, the continuation of the civil rights struggle through religious channels against the evangelicals, and so there are struggles going on in these areas, which becoming crucial politically to how things are going to work out as we move into this crazy next few years, where we are likely to see politics upended in various ways, and I see it being upended in this way, both by the evangelicals that I'm talking about this time, but as I was talking about last time, the increasing fusion of state and capital, and to the point where authoritarian autocracy becomes, if you like, the natural form of government, which is going to come out of that fusion.
Thank you for joining me today. You've been listening to David Harvey's Anti-Capitalist Chronicles, a Democracy at Work production.